Welcome to this webinar on advancing responsible sourcing in mineral supply chains. In this webinar, you will find out how minerals can be sourced responsibly, how different regions worldwide perceive and implement due diligence and responsible sourcing, and what could be the way forward for the EU responsible sourcing policy. My name is Ursula Kopp. I'm team member of the Institute for Managing Sustainability at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I will be your facilitator for today. André, may I hand over to you now?
My name is André Martinuzzi. I'm head of the Institute for Managing Sustainability and coordinator of the DiliCHANCE Project, and also from my side, a warm welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you come from. I have to say I'm deeply impressed. 78 participants and a lot more coming in. Great. This is the first webinar in a project called DiliCHANCE that my team and I have the pleasure to coordinate. The first of these events is always a very charming moment. It's the moment where we get to know each other, and I hope that we will build some relationships, some networks within this project. The project started a few months ago. Next slide, please. And it addresses due diligence in supply chains. So the whole issue of supply chain responsibility in mineral supply chains will be covered. And to our impression, this goes far beyond compliance and far beyond minimal requirements. And in case I'm now mentioning things that you already know, please forgive me. But if in case I miss something, if you have any more ideas about responsible supply chains and supply chain responsibility, just note your ideas into the chat. That would be very lovely. So, when we look back the last years, we've seen that supply chain responsibility was an issue of resilience, was an issue of environment, was an issue of competitiveness, and an issue of human rights. And now we've seen that things were quite tough, were quite intense for companies. You just have to consider the CSDD regulation in Europe. But now, as you heard about it, probably the Omnibus package is a little bit softening the requirements. And for all the companies that acted according to a frame, well, if regulation says I have to, then I have to, but let's please do it with a minimum level, with a minimal requirements, as easy and efficient as possible. They miss a lot of opportunities, because I think that in supply chain responsibility there are a lot of opportunities, because when you take supply chain management responsibly, then you create long-term value, then you strengthen the resilience and the stability of your supply chains. You reduce risks, technical risks, image risks, reputation risks, so it preserves your reputation. But on top, and we have found this in a series of case studies we've done last year, with supply chain collaboration, it enables companies to innovate in a collaborative manner. Together, a supplier and its customer, a customer and supplier, business-to-business collaborations are possible, and the innovation potential is much higher than if you perceive your suppliers just as business-to-business contacts. And also, it avoids C-level lawsuits. And most of all, it protects people, planet, and profit. So if you have more ideas about that, more ideas what other benefits supply chain responsibility has, then please note them into the chat. On the next slide, you will see what DiliCHANCE can offer to you. DiliCHANCE is a 3-year European project, and in this project funded by the European Commission, we will develop a virtual one-stop shop. So basically an online platform on responsible business conduct in mineral supply chains. And in the next slide, please don't switch to the next slide at the moment. On the next slide then, I will show you what you can expect from this virtual one-stop shop. It will, for example, have a navigator for regulation standards and tools. And aside of these virtual activities, we also do things in the real world. We test tools, we run series of workshops with digital tool providers to help them to increase the technical and methodological maturity. And there, by now, I think my team collected 250 tools. So for sure, there is not a shortage of tools. There is much more the bigger problem, which tool fits to which purpose, fits to which company. We will also develop lighthouse cases of companies, of highly successful companies that serve as an example how supply chain responsibility can be a strategic success factor. And last but not least, we will show effective pathways to involve the people affected, regional stakeholders or workers, into due diligence assurance mechanisms. This is what we plan to do in the next 3 years, and there will be an official launch of our one-stop shop at the World Resource Forum conference in early September. So if you're by chance in Geneva, in Switzerland, you want to drop by, happy to meet you there. If you're not in Geneva, join us virtually at this launch event from all around the world. So what will be launched, next slide please, is a digital one-stop shop. It will offer comprehensive information for both, for beginners, but also for professionals. For beginners, it will give them an orientation about what is supply chain due diligence, what are the most important steps to take when you do due diligence risk assessments, what do you need, what regulations do you have to keep in mind, what standards are available, but also deep dive for professionals who want to have real profound information on several topics. It will help you to navigate among these hundreds of regulation standards and digital tools, and it will provide you with an easy self-check and later on also targeted learning materials that perfectly fit your needs. So as you see, this addresses businesses, but also research, also policy making, also NGOs. Diligence is implemented by a group of organizations. They joined and formed a highly qualified and powerful partnership, and it's my pleasure that many of them are here today as well. And I would like to thank to all of these 10 partners for the brilliant collaboration. I coordinated EU projects now for more than 20 years, and I can tell you this is a real nice partnership. Very nice partners, very effective partners, and very strong partners. Very broad diversity. You can see, for example, there are civil society organizations as WWF, but also consultancies as KPMG and Living Sources. There are stakeholder organizations as EIT Raw Materials or World Resource Forum. There is a software company as Static, and there are also research institutes as BRGM and civil society organizations as Solidaritate Navima. Guys, it's great to collaborate with you, and we have big things to do. And our first webinar with now nearly 100 participants is a first milestone in this project. It's a pleasure that you joined us, and we're looking forward to a very interesting hour. Thank you very much.
Welcome to everyone again, and welcome to our 3 speakers. Thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your expertise. There is Alex Graf, who used to work with us for a long time, and he moved to Berlin and he's now working for Kumi Consulting there. And there is Shazad Manocheri from the World Resources Forum, and Andreas Endl, a colleague of ours. They work together on projects, and they also work together on a book. And I would love to start with Alex Graf. He has a significant experience in EU and international sustainability issues and agendas in Europe and in Asia, and he focuses on sustainable sourcing of raw materials as a manager for Kumi Consulting, a company that advises worldwide on sustainable business practices. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you, André, and thank you to the entire team of Vienna University, and of course also the DiliCHANCE project team as such. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking about responsible sourcing, the very topic that, we have been working together for the last couple of years, and which I continue to work on also at Kumi. Just very quickly to add on to what you said, Ursula, for background. So at Kumi, I'm a manager, and Kumi Consulting is a specialist consulting firm on responsible sourcing, more specifically due diligence, where we have basically 2 strands in our portfolio. On the one hand, the policy side, where we are directly collaborating with the Commission on different due diligence related legislation, supporting them in the implementation of these aspects. So, for example, conflict minerals regulation, batteries regulation, critical raw materials act, etc. And at the same time, also, of course, then the private sector strand, where we then helping companies also to implement and prepare for these legislations. And based on these experiences, but also actually based on the experiences from another Horizon project, actually, that I was involved in, I will present to you a bit more on the responsible sourcing of mineral raw materials from, as you can read here, a macro perspective. Next slide, please. Yeah, so a bit for background, what I will be talking about when I say macro perspective and responsible sourcing in mineral value chains is basically based on the so-called resourcing project. The resourcing project was a Horizon 2020 project, also coordinated by Vienna University of Economics and Business, together with in total 12 partners. I was also involved in that project, but as Ursula already hinted at, and for transparency reasons, this was before my time at Kumi, so it's not related to Kumi, this work. By and large, it was basically the ambition to establish something like a multi-stakeholder platform to promote a systemic and integrated approach to responsible sourcing. Based also with on 3 focus sectors, as you can see them here, so renewables, mobility, and electronic and electric equipment. More specifically, what this included, and from just looking at the attendance here, I think some of you have been involved also in the project in one way or another. So we created something like policy roadmaps of how to achieve responsible sourcing until 2050. Private sector best practices, multi-stakeholder engagement, etc., etc. And one of the main outcomes then at the end, final outcomes, because we had a lot of deliverables basically. One of these major outcomes then was the final book basically, or the final publication, as you can see it here, Advancing Responsible Sourcing in Mineral Value Chains. And I was one of the editors of this book, but also my colleagues, so Scheherazade and Andreas, were authors. And you will hear also some parts of the book in their presentations. So yeah, based on this background, let's dive into responsible sourcing. Next slide, please. So, well, first and foremost, what is responsible sourcing? And well, there are definitely different definitions out there what responsible sourcing may be. And you will also find in our book a definition. And I think one of my colleagues will also then show you how in the resourcing project we approach this definition. But basically, in simple terms, what you could say is if you achieve and maintain basically the following aspects, what you can see here. So from the environmental, social, and economic aspects, or as we call them also sustainability aspects, if you achieve what you see here, then you're basically sourcing responsibly. Now, what you can see, this is quite a holistic view that we are promoting on the one hand. So the different, again, environmental, social, economic aspects. Also, when you're looking a bit deeper into these different aspects as they're listed here, you can see, well, responsible sourcing as we approached it is not just about, as you often hear it, about, well, how to avoid negative impacts, how to manage risks, etc. But it is also about actually how to create benefits and how to share benefits. So it's both sides, impacts and benefits, and how to share impacts and benefits. Also, what is important to mention here, of course, it's not just about the sustainability aspects as such, but then underpinning them with notions such as the international cooperation, harmonized reporting, etc. When you look at this, 2 big questions I think would come up. Number one, well, this is nice, this is good. We can maybe all agree on this general level that these are important aspects, but what to focus on and how to decide what to focus on. And this is then where the important notion of prioritization comes in. And as you may imagine, and as you probably know from your own practice, there are geographic differences, there are stakeholder differences, there are different interests and needs based on which the different stakeholders then would have different priorities. So this is one aspect. And in the presentation also of Scheherazade, I think we will then hear, for example, more about regional perspectives in this regard and what this means. So this is one important aspect. The other big question, closely related, but not the same, is then, of course, okay, again, nice what you see here, but how to achieve this? How to achieve what we see here at the end of the day. And without being able now in this presentation, of course, to go into the details of every single aspect, as you can see it here, because it would require a lot of technical expertise, etc. Just to give you some glimpses and bits and pieces of how we approach this in the publication that I just showed before. Next slide, please. So how to source responsibly. At the end of the day, what it is about is it's from a systemic and holistic point of view, the meaningful coordinated interaction of major stakeholders from policy, from the private sector, civil society, and research. As I just mentioned, here are just a few glimpses, a few blips and examples. You will find much more in the book. But what is important to see here, well, there are different responsibilities, there are different approaches and tools. And first and foremost, no matter what responsibilities and approaches we talk to, they are underpinned by common international frameworks, a few of which are listed here from the United Nations, the OECD, ILO, but there are also others, such as, for example, the EITI on fiscal transparency, etc., if you're familiar with that, and more. Without going into the details, again, have a look in the book. You can also read here the different aspects. I think one or two points I would like to dive in is, on the one hand, what you can read on policy or under policy, creating an enabling framework or enabling framework conditions. I think what this relates to, at least what we emphasize on what we emphasized in the projects, were two aspects. Number one, the need for harmonization. And number two, the need for a level playing field. And I think both these aspects are very timely. You can see them in the already mentioned omnibus discussions, etc. So when we're talking about harmonization, the need of, well, coordinated efforts towards responsible sourcing. There's a lot out there on the voluntary level in terms of standards, certifications, guidelines, etc. But also on the regulatory side, more and more legislation is coming up. So the need for harmonization is important. At the same time, level playing field, as I just mentioned, level playing field is crucial in order to assure that companies are being able to conduct responsible sourcing without the fear of losing out or without the fear of a competitive disadvantage. This brings me already to the private sector. A second point I would like to dive in here on this slide is the need for private sector to take ownership. What this basically means, in a nutshell, if you want, to basically take on and take seriously the responsibility as a company or as a business, the responsibility that you have in order to understand and take seriously the impact of your operations. The impact of your operations in terms of, well, your products, your business model, etc. The impact on the people and the planet. And when we are talking about ownership, products, business models, etc., this is not only your own operations, but, and this is where responsible sourcing then comes in, of course, also your supply chain. And again, just to understand also the interaction here, having enabling framework conditions is a crucial prerequisite for ownership of the private sector in this regard. Maybe before I jump to the next slide, just one point here, civil society and research. I cannot actually overemphasize the need also to collaborate with civil society and the contribution that civil society can make actually in this regard in terms of representing unheard voices, providing important knowledge, especially on the ground knowledge, etc. I have two more slides before I hand over. I will keep it short, in which I would like to introduce two more crucial concepts actually that as we see them in responsible sourcing. Next slide, please. One is related to what we call behavior, the change of behavior. So when we are talking about, well, how to achieve the different sustainability aspects, as I mentioned them, and also in terms of what are the different roles and responsibilities, all this is at the end of the day geared towards establishing and maintaining certain behaviors and conducts of the different stakeholders. And what you can see here is just a very quick overview as we provide them in the book, how actually behavior is needed and how a change of behavior is needed in order to understand or in order to establish then basically what we call here also a sustainable future. And you can see the importance of what we call codes of behavior. Codes of behavior relates again, especially to those international frameworks that I already mentioned, which then hopefully trigger actual change in the practice, in the operating behavior, etc. Now this sounds very abstract, but at the end of the day, behavior and codes of conduct are actually crucial in this regard. And hopefully during the conversation, we have a bit more time, and I'm happy to provide one or two examples what this means in practice actually. So Next slide, please. Next and last slide. So after the notion of behaviors, the second notion I would like to emphasize is the idea of a rights-based approach. Again, when we talk about responsible sourcing, often what we have in mind is, well, voluntary commitments or voluntary standards by companies in order to conduct, or other stakeholders to conduct responsible sourcing. But this is actually a misunderstanding of the very essence of responsible sourcing. Because at the end of the day, what it is about is, it is about securing the legitimate rights of, well, may it be communities, consumers, workers, or other stakeholders. So in that sense, it is important to understand that responsible sourcing is a duty towards these rights holders. Again, happy to discuss in more detail what these different roles of rights holders and duty bearers means. But overall, the importance is for duty bearers to proactively secure these rights, to act whenever there is an infringement on these rights, but also then to be held accountable if no action is being taken. And from that perspective, I think you can then also understand why efforts such as, for example, mandatory due diligence, mandatory sustainability legislation, etc., is so crucial in this regard, precisely to stress and emphasize the need of a rights-based approach. I think I leave it with that. Again, the book and the entire project in that sense provided a conceptual framework of responsible sourcing. And how to basically have a coordinated conversation in this regard, and also on its including its implementation. Now, the big question is then, of course, well, again, nice and beautiful, but so what? What does this mean in the actual day-to-day practice? And my response to this is you will find much more on this in the book in terms of best practice, in terms of also the challenges of implementing responsible sourcing. And again, also, I hope we have the chance, and I'm happy to provide some more concrete examples then also during the conversation, also based on my current work at Kumi, what this means, what concepts like behavioral change, rights-based approach, etc. can mean in practice. Yeah, thanks a lot, and back to you, Ursula.
And I would like to welcome now Shazad Manoucheri. She's Program Director of the World Resources Forum Association, an NGO promoting sustainability and fairness in the global use of natural resources. She has been engaged in multiple international projects, and besides her extensive knowledge in mineral resource governance and responsible mining, she also has first-hand insight into the challenges of the artisanal and small-scale mining sector and the impacted communities in Africa. Welcome, Shazad, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ursula, for the introduction, and thanks to all the participants for joining this webinar. It's definitely my pleasure to be part of this panel. Next slide, if possible. Yeah, thank you. So with the background we heard from Alex about the book and the theoretical concept of responsible sourcing, it is obvious that responsible sourcing expectations and regulations cannot be defined based on the priorities of one single country. And this is mainly because mineral supply chains are globally interconnected, meaning that responsible sourcing expectations and requirements are equally global. Also that the environmental impacts associated with mineral value chains go beyond national or regional borders, and consequently solutions to these challenges require understanding and cooperation at a global scale. And the other dimension is that mineral supply chains are the cornerstone of economic development for resource-rich countries. And if there is a market shift in one area, the economic and social well-being of communities reliant on mineral resources can be at risk. So when we were developing a common definition for responsible sourcing, we had to understand regional differences and preferences. For this, we focused on Africa, Latin America, and China, and organized the stakeholder engagement activities in form of interviews, workshops, and panel discussions in these regions to identify how they perceive and approach sustainable and responsible practices across mineral supply chains. And to understand these priorities, we started with acknowledging the challenges and needs in these regions. Next slide, please. So starting with the economic context, we could see that the economy of both Africa and Latin America is heavily dependent on export of mineral resources. And while this resource endowment is a great opportunity for both regions, the dependency on export can lead to their vulnerability to market fluctuations. And consequently, both regions need to diversify their economies. In contrast, China is a key player in all stages of the mineral value chains, specifically in the processing and refining phase, and also the country has high investment capacity beyond its borders in other countries. But despite the investment in other countries, still the country needs secure access to supply of raw materials for its own industry. Next slide, please. In Africa and Latin America, if we look at the political and regulatory systems, it's a diverse landscape. While some countries have robust and strong regulatory frameworks, some are still struggling to formulate effective regulations. And even where regulatory frameworks are in place, the challenge is sometimes in enforcement and implementation of these frameworks. And in case of China, slightly different. There is a centralized decision-making and regulatory control, and there exists the authority to enforce policies and standards related to responsible sourcing. Next slide, please. And then looking at the environmental and social considerations, both Africa and Latin America have been the focal point for discussions related to environment degradation, social impacts, and conflicts related to mineral extraction. And there has been a pressure from civil society organizations, specifically in Latin America, to adopt responsible sourcing practices in these regions. Also in case of China, its rapid industrialization and willingness to short-term economic gains has led to cases where environmental and social considerations have been compromised, both at domestic and at global level. And as a result, the country has received widespread criticism. Next slide, please. So with this brief overview of regional context in mind, like the challenges and the needs of these regions, we acknowledge the commonalities and divergence in how responsible sourcing is prioritized, valued, and acted upon in these studied regions. A summary of these points are in these slides, but more details are included in the book for those who are interested. A common priority for resource-rich countries in general, specifically for Africa and Latin America, is to leverage their mineral resource endowment to serve the socio-economic development of the country or the region. And this means that local socio-economic considerations should be considered in responsible sourcing approaches. Another common objective, which is becoming increasingly important, is the priority to go beyond the extraction phase and move up the value chain in these regions. While this strategy is kind of well developed in China, it has become a key aspiration for Africa and Latin America, and several regional and national bodies are working on adopting policies with a focus on mineral beneficiation in these regions. Depending on the degree of economic development, another common objective of these resource-rich countries is to develop their own domestic and regional supply chains around renewable energy and digital technologies. And for this, they would like to attract investment in innovation and research and development for high-tech industries. So in line with these economic or political objectives, all of these regions have the aspiration to manage trade-offs between resource extraction and environmental and social risks associated with this industry. And in this regard, both Latin America and Africa have shown willingness to engage in international processes and contribute to formulation and adoption of internationally agreed standards for responsible sourcing. Also, another point is that this social capital and civil society trust has been a priority specifically for mining sector in Latin America and Africa. And the specific topic that has gained importance in the recent discussions is related to sourcing from artisanal and small-scale mining sector. There has been a tendency from mining or downstream companies to disengage from ASM production sources, mainly because of the potential operational risks with this sector. However, good practice is to recognize the importance of the sector of the artisanal and small-scale mining sector for the livelihood of communities and engage responsibly with the sector. And in case of China, the country has acknowledged that compliance with national legislation is not enough anymore. So they have to comply with standards beyond their borders. And based on the consultation that we organized in China, at least several Chinese mining companies acknowledge that they are working towards compliance with different international standards. Also, they referring to their collaboration with the OECD for developing the due diligence, Chinese due diligence guidance was mentioned, and also trying to comply with good international industry practices. However, there is still a big challenge of transparency for this purpose. So with this, I would like to ask for the next slide with kind of concluding words that a way forward is that it is important, obviously, to consider that responsible sourcing solutions should be tailored to the local context and be developed based on the unique challenges and priorities of those who are impacted by the operations. However, these solutions should follow the common goal of delivering environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and economic equity. So just again mentioning that more details about these priorities or challenges are explained in the book. In this short presentation, I tried to summarize the key aspects. Thank you for your attention, and back to you, Ursula.
Thank you very much, Shahzad. I'm seeing lots of questions already in the chat, but before we go there, I would love to introduce Andreas Endl, a colleague of ours here in Vienna. He has gained experience in raw material and resource policy for approximately 15 years now, with extensive experiences in policy analysis in the raw material sector, but also in designing stakeholder processes and peer learning processes and learning platforms. André, please share your insights.
Thank you, Ursula, and hello and welcome, everyone. Happy to see that the number of participants remain quite stable, and 100 for the first webinar, as André mentioned, is quite impressive. To keep it very short, since we want to go into discussions a bit more, I want to give you a tour de force of responsible sourcing policy within the EU. Things we worked within the resourcing project, things we will continue in other initiatives such as DiliCHANCE to support the EU responsible sourcing, responsible business conduct policy agenda. Grid of lessons learned and how far it came from first approaches, how evidence-based policymaking fed into new policy programs on responsible sourcing, and where are we now and what is to come in the future. if we just orient ourselves on how responsible sourcing is situated within the larger context of the EU Green Deal to really transform EU economy towards a more sustainable one. We have a very small part, and I think my colleagues will highlight in a moment, of what we call product raw material policy that is part of this bigger picture. And we'll come back to that in the end, of the kind of synthesis that we kind of keep the ideals of a Green Deal of sustainable development within responsible sourcing and not kind of dilute that further. And within that, even further, we have some more initiatives such as the Corporate Social Reporting Directive and the upcoming Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive that help us kind of bring a responsible business conduct discourse from a horizontal, more generic kind of view into the raw materials sector specifically. The next slide, please. If we bundle what we consider responsible sourcing policy, we have a couple of kind of common things we see, usually the EU Conflict Mineral Regulation, a Corporate Social Reporting Directive, the Battery Regulation, Conflict Raw Materials Act, Critical Minerals Act, then the EU Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive. And what we see where we stand right now, we have been in a kind of policy genealogy from 2021 up to 2025 with what we consider broadly an inception phase of what responsible sourcing policy looks like in this package, and an implementation phase later. And when adoption is finalized, European lawmakers come to grips and to work and make sense of that, and also ultimately final clients, such as businesses who need to comply in the end. So just to kind of differentiate, there was kind of a genealogy, an evolution of sourcing policy within the EU, starting with the Conflict Mineral Regulation and up to now, what we will hopefully see to manifest on a horizontal level in the Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive. Next slide, please. And to briefly highlight, there has been quite a learning process in this policy genealogy, looking even beyond the big water to the US of what the Dodd-Frank Act did with conflict minerals and what the EU kind of incorporated into the EU Conflict Mineral Regulation, such as not looking on to geographies only when it comes to conflict minerals, and also kind of trying to really resolve the problem of really disengaging from this region and having a de facto embargo on conflict minerals. This is all that kind of fed into the kind of pilot EU policy on responsible sourcing with regards to minerals, the conflict mineral regulation. But also here we see some shortcomings and lessons to be learned for hopefully upcoming or right now to be transposed EU policies such as the battery regulation is really the lack of leverage by EU importers on the suppliers, smelters, refiners, etc. The access to remedy as missing the legal liability question. We see assurance practitioners only kind of falling back into reporting as an obligation in a box ticking exercise, and really the lack of enforcement mechanisms such as liability and access to remedy for really holding companies responsible for the impact in supply chain. This is what we primarily learned from a first approach in the conflict mineral regulation, which we hope to see in upcoming regulatory packages being done a bit better. And when we see right now, however, in Europe, there's quite a change of a general political climate. You can see votings in different member states kind of bringing an anti-sentiment a bit to what we generally call responsible sourcing policies, but kind of reversing the trend of all these ideas in the policy learning cycle we've seen so far in the past. And most recently, and I think it's fair to say and fair to mention, the EU policy revision package, what we call the Omnibus package. And just to highlight a couple of things that are still on the table and under negotiation, but might kind of manifest in the broader sense of responsible sourcing policies, sustainability and due diligence requirements, really to simplify and harmonize due diligence requirements, really looking only into tier one suppliers at one potential, limiting the amount of information companies need to in their supply chain, mapping, completely removing EU civil liability conditions, however, while still preserving the rights of victims for full compensation. And really, I think, and here we are quite up to date to inform you, really give companies more time to prepare to comply. And even as we spoke today, EU Parliament came together and actually voted for a delay of the transposition times for both member states by +1 year until July 2027, as well as for the larger companies with 5,000 plus employees and major turnover of 1.5 billion euro to be transposed or be compliant with the Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive only by 2028. So that was just while we are discussing important things here, Parliament came together and at least from the proposal Stop the Clock, they further delayed the transposition implementation of the newer EU responsible sourcing policies in this regard. And the next slide, please. That's the last one. And then I'm happy to go into discussion. So what about different initiatives, multi-stakeholder projects, research endeavors, and how they can help actually both inception and implementation of EU responsible sourcing projects or policies in this regard. Really looking back into the resourcing policies, I think we did a lot of strategic visioning and roadmaps for different sectors, for different actors and players to kind of prepare the ground for what we consider a strong responsible sourcing approach. Provide a proof of concept from both a policy practice and a business practice point of view, and also kind of bring together different actors, most important rights holders, representatives there of multi-stakeholder organization. Advocacy is playing an important part in what we consider the primary inception phase of responsible sourcing policy package. However, at a certain point, businesses will need to comply, will need to hopefully at one point go beyond legal compliance for responsible sourcing or due diligence. In this regard, the DiliCHANCE project for us is more focusing really on helping companies comply with upcoming regulations going beyond by, for example, looking into digital human rights environmental due diligence tools, improving them, helping tool providers, but also finding the right solution of company problems in the so-called one-stop shop, the digital platform André mentioned at the very beginning, we will launch in summer to really have a portal, the one portal, where everything kind of is neatly put together, kind of put into context, be it regulation, be it standards, or be it the individual tools that respond to regulation and standards and help companies in their individual endeavors where they are on the journey towards due diligence, responsible sourcing. An important part, I think, is also bringing on top of the level the assurance practitioner with trainings on site and on learn to really kind of avoid the box ticking exercise as we've seen in previous responsible sourcing policy approaches so far. I think that's just a couple of things we have in store for you when DiliCHANCE really starts kickstarting, at least from the one-stop shop perspective in summer this year, but also further in the project implementation in the next 3 years, we will be there on track and supporting companies in their due diligence endeavors. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Ursula. Happy to respond to any questions. I saw a couple of ones popping up. Yeah, sticking around for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Andy, for your insights. Yeah, I'll start somewhere and we try to go through the questions as they are. There was one by Johannes about the environmental criteria that resource listed to define responsible sourcing. And he says they look great, but rather idealistic, maybe far beyond responsible and more towards sustainable. Does any one of you want to reply to that? Or to...
If I may briefly, hello, Johannes, and thanks for your question. Definitely, indeed, an important one. I think it drills down to the project outputs, the roadmaps we created from the individual sectors, but really showing the vision and long-term road ahead. So not being down to earth, but really being very idealistic, optimistic of where we actually need to be in order to. And here we come, take the turn around to international agreements or political conventions agenda, such as the Paris Accords, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, such as OECD and ILO conventions. To really kind of make this work, we need to be actually on the forefront and be more progressive than what we usually see around with policy programs. And that, I think, responds to the 3 sector roadmaps we did in the resourcing project.
Thank you. Shazad, I was going to ask you how the EU can influence the implementation of responsible sourcing approaches in other regions. And there were a couple of questions also raising the topic of maybe can these initiatives bring peace to some regions, like the Congo was mentioned here. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit, how you see the influence and what influence is possible in those other regions?
Thank you, Ursula, for the question. Yeah, indeed, a very important question. And we have seen policy interventions recently. Alex or Andy, I don't remember, referred to the Critical Raw Materials Act by the European Commission. That one of the strategies of the Critical Raw Materials Act for securing access to critical raw materials for green transition in Europe is to encourage international cooperation and strategic partnerships with resource-rich countries. And when you look at the some of these MOUs, these memorandum of understandings that have been signed between the European Commission and some African countries like Namibia, Zambia, or the DRC, or also with Latin American countries like Chile and Argentina. One of the main pillars of these partnerships is, of course, alignment of cooperation on ESG criteria and international standards on responsible sourcing and responsible practices. So if these criteria will be taken seriously into consideration, then that would be a leverage for ensuring that any investment in these resource-rich countries will be based on these environmental, social, and governance requirements. However, I should also mention that despite all these efforts and the related provisions in this memorandum of understandings, there is still areas that can be improved. There is areas highlighted by civil society organizations that there is a need for stringent and careful due diligence on projects when there will be potential projects, strategic projects in these regions. It is important to consider more detailed and careful due diligence processes on environmental and social impacts. So in short, there is the possibility, actually these partnerships is a very good way to ensure implication of responsible sourcing and due diligence practices. But in practice and in implementation phase, then of course there will be challenges.
Thank you very much, Shazad. May I now put together two questions, maybe, and to all of you who wants to answer. There was one, would you elaborate a little further on the effects of the postponing of the implementation of the EU CSDDD? What does this mean for us as the community? And how do you evaluate the impact of the postponement and the downsizing of CSDDD on all the preparation process that has been going on within companies, within consultancies, etc.? What impact does it have on the sector? Not an easy question, maybe.
I can, if you want, I can make a start also again from a company perspective, also what we see, because we receive often similar questions along the lines, what does it mean now for us? What should we do? How should we act actually in view of this? And well, of course, it is really difficult to foresee how this will play out and how the different sectors and how the different actors within the sectors will respond to it. Certain things that we can definitely see, also feedback from companies, is this uncertainty and the CSDDD now being delayed also in terms of the enforcement, etc., makes it often more difficult for companies to actually receive information and to engage with suppliers. because often it is a very easy starting point for companies. Say, look, this is how the legislation looks like, and this is what's needed now. So please support us. With this uncertainty, of course, this leverage is gone. So this is, for example, one concrete issue that we can see. But again, from a broader perspective, it is difficult to foresee how it plays out. What we advise companies in this regard is, no matter the delays and no matter the uncertainties, don't wait. Because again, also as I said in our or in my presentation, the basis for all these are certain international frameworks, also especially when it comes to the due diligence legislation. We're talking about the OECD due diligence frameworks, about the UNGPs, and they are all known, and they are the basis for these laws, and they won't change. Also, when you look at the changes of the CSDDD, for example, these changes are mainly in terms of scope and liability, but not in terms of the actual practices and systems that you have to implement. So these things are known, and therefore the advice that we usually give is really in this regard, keep continuing implementing them as long as you are guided by these international frameworks. At least there shouldn't be any big surprises once these uncertainties are resolved over time.
Yeah, if I may briefly to respond to the question of timeliness or delayed transposition. I think Alex mentioned it, from a preparatory standpoint of business has been preparing on this for years now, since it has been in the policy discourse. There have been proponents who argued on the business sector quite for that, and kind of bringing this uncertainty again in the name of competitiveness is again kind of a distortion for companies in their long-term planning. So that's the general point of view. With regard to the substantive nature of changes, maybe to the omnibus package it has on due diligence requirements, they will be quite fundamental and quite deep if they really manifest. Right now, nothing is decided. Some recommendations have been put forward. It's been up to the council and the parliament and the lawmakers actually to decide on that. But if they manifest, at least when it comes to the corporate social due diligence directive, it will tremendously deviate from a risk-based due diligence approach, looking not beyond tier one suppliers, being quite restricted when it comes to stakeholder engagement. So what we've seen in international normative frameworks, it will be quite far from what we actually should be aiming at when it comes to UN guiding principles for human rights or the OECD framework. So this would be quite a step back when it comes to really actually fulfilling the obligations of what the EU kind of proposed in its Green Deal objectives. So it will be quite a step back when it comes to protecting people and the environment on an EU and global scale.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to add something?
Just to add on, because of what you just mentioned, Andy, actually, I think a lot of these changes are still actually subject to interpretation, and where we really also need to wait for the guidelines. A very good example is especially the limitation now to only tier one suppliers. How this will look in detail is very much open at this point, and depends on the interpretation of certain notions such as plausible information on the level of operations, of direct business relationships, etc. So again, as I said, depending on the interpretation, we will see what the impact will be at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. There is a maybe difficult question that we might not be able to answer, but you might want to reply and try to discuss it. The Trump's tariffs, how will they affect the advances of responsible sourcing? Or what do you expect, or what can you imagine?
I can take this quickly, but happy also, of course, for Shirazad and Anil to respond, mainly because I responded already to the question, and then there came a question back to me, which I haven't responded to yet. So in short, I mean, from our experience, it can be expected that the tariffs will increase the pressure on the supply chain, which means in turn that this will be compensated through lower sustainability standards, especially in countries or regions with weaker governance. In terms of, because I mentioned and also in my written reply that we can already see hints in this regard. An example would be, without of course being able to drop any names here, but we could already see before the latest round of tariffs that, for example, big US retailers were announcing to renegotiate prices with their suppliers. And especially in supply chains and in sectors with low margins, for example, textile is a very good example, and the US is almost 100% dependent on non-US supply chains when it comes to textiles. This will have a big impact on social and environmental sustainability, because then again, the suppliers themselves need to compensate it somehow. And yeah, as I just said, we can expect how this goes, especially in specific countries with weak governance.
Thank you, Alex. As there are a couple of more questions there, we would be happy to stay for another 10 or 15 minutes if you like to stay and keep discussing. That's also fine for us. Let me go back to one question that might be for Shazad again. EU responsible sourcing policies will be good for resource sustainability, but what are these for artisanal and small-scale mining, for formal supplies, and the people in the mining communities, especially women and youth? I don't know if you have replied to that partly.
No,
is there something to add?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ursula. Yeah, this is indeed a very important question. And if you look at the requirements in this memorandum of understandings that the European Commission has signed with some countries, there is one specific provisions on artisanal and small-scale mining. And at this level, it's mainly at the level of capacity building and supporting with formalization. This is one very specific area that has been mentioned in these agreements and these partnerships. Again, at the implementation level, this is indeed a very challenging process because based on the country, based on the contents, the context, based on the commodity, there will not be a one solution that would fit for everywhere. So it really depends a close collaboration with national governments, with national authorities to identify the key areas that should be addressed by these partnerships. And this cannot be done from already the European perspective. This is something that should be solved in collaboration and with a clear governance at the local level. So for example, just as an example, if a government has not endorsed artisanal miners in their national laws, then there will be obviously a challenge for implementation of the improvements in the sector.
Let me just give you a hint on what we are planning next. Because of the rising uncertainty in global markets and regulations, we will hold our next webinar quite soon on May 13. And there we will hear from the European Commission, from the OECD, from experts and industry on how businesses can navigate these times with a long-term view that is practically effective and adaptable. And we will discuss the ongoing value of responsible business conduct and due diligence in managing uncertainty. You can already register now for this webinar. The link is in the chat. Thank you very, very much to all our partners, to our speakers. Thank you to all my colleagues who have been working in the background to make this webinar possible, and especially to you for your time and for your interest. Hope to see you somewhere soon. Thank you very much. Take care.